So we're going to open the floor to questions. I'm sure you have a lot of them, but before we do, I just want to ask you, what's your experience coming to conventions like this? And have you done it all through your tenure? And what do you think of one like FanExpo?
Oh, it seems very nice. I haven't seen much of it yet, but it looks crowded. I'm sure that over the weekend it will probably be more crowded than it is today. But we've always used the fan-based audience as kind of a jumping off place for science fiction. The very first Star Wars film, we decided we'd have to sell to the core audience first. So in the summer of 1976, I went to the Worldcon in Kansas City, and with about 5 Ralph McQuarrie paintings, a mock-up of R2 and 3PO, a Darth Vader costume on a dummy, and about 25 color transparencies that I took myself on the set, and that was all we had. And kind of talked to the fans. Oh, and Mark Hamill came too, and so we had a little chat with the fans that year, and we went to Comic-Con that year in San Diego as well. And so that was the beginning of the idea of getting interest in the Star Wars as a film, which was all it was going to be at that time. And, so I enjoy the conventions. I think they're very, very good.
So going back to '76, a year before the release, were people receptive at that point? I mean, was there a huge advance buzz about Star Wars even then?
No, there wasn't actually. Nobody knew about it until those appearances, basically. But we had kind of worked out a campaign that would at least make the name available to the audience. The comic book came out 3 months before the film came out. I went to, with Charlie Lippincott, I went to the book publishers convention that year in San Francisco, and we promoted the novel and the novelization. There wasn't a whole lot of interest there, but we got the name out. So those were the main things that helped to promote the film. It was a day, it's hard to think today that there was a time before there was instant communication. There was no internet, no mobile phones, no hardly any computers even, and
there was Twitter though, right?
So it took a whole process of working out how you get the interest generated, and it was a traditional process that the studios had used for years and years and years. It was mostly newspaper clients, articles, interviews. So we used all of those traditional tools too, but the convention thing was new.
Well, the first Star Wars film that I saw in the theaters was Return of the Jedi. So going back to '77, when A New Hope was released, at what point did you know that you had not just a big film on your hands, but potentially a phenomenon?
Well, it was a while because we expected the first month, or maybe even the first 2 months, that it would be mostly fan-based audience. So it wasn't a surprise to see long lines, especially if you've got to remember that the first Star Wars opened in 42 cinemas in the States, and there were, I think, 4 here in Canada, and that was it. And because it was the Dolby stereo sound that was the part of the problem. There was a twofold problem, really. There was the sound special equipment that had to be installed, and the cinemas did not want to pay for that. So Fox paid for that, but they only would pay for so many cinemas. And the second problem was interest in science fiction was pretty low. The exhibitors didn't really think that the film had a whole lot of potential. So Fox kind of bribed the cinemas in a way to take the film by promising them their big summer film, which was called The Other Side of Midnight, which was a kind of soap opera, I think you would probably call it, relationship drama. It was based on a fairly famous novel at the time, so they thought that was going to be the big summer film.
So they thought Star Wars would be like the B-side to that.
Right.
Right here. Whoops. Any questions from the floor right now? Let's open it up, sir.
I had a question about when you first started planning the epic, being that the science fiction genre was low, how do you get funding for something like that? You go from concept in your head to putting it out and saying, well, we need money to get this movie off the ground. Like today, you'd have to have an internet following and a fan base before you could even think about getting.
Well, we were lucky in a way because American Graffiti was popular. We generated, we owned the film, so we generated profits out of that. And so we used that money to do the development work on Star Wars. It wasn't a lot, actually. We had the script time, and that was about a year of script writing, but the company only had 4 people. So it was a fairly inexpensive process. And then we hired Ralph McQuarrie to do the artwork, and we only had enough money really to hire him to do 10 paintings at that time. And he did that work, and then I hired Alice Tavaleras to do storyboards on 2 sequences. And he basically worked for his brother, Dean Tavaleras, who was a production designer for the Godfather films, and was working with Francis at that time. That's how we knew him. And he was willing to do these little bits in between the other work, and so it didn't cost very much. And that was really the package, plus a kind of preliminary budget that I put together. So it wasn't much, but, and most of the studios turned it down anyway. It was 20th Century Fox who agreed to go with it, and it was primarily because they had seen American Graffiti. The deal we made with Fox was just before American Graffiti came out in 1973. And if we had waited until American Graffiti had come out and gotten reviews and proved to be a success and stuff, we probably could have made a better deal with Fox than we did. But anyway, Fox, Alan Ladd Jr., who ran Fox at the time, he liked American Graffiti. He thought that we had potential as a team, and he didn't quite understand the script of Star Wars. I don't think anybody did at that point anyway. It's very difficult with a lot of films to read a script and try to visualize what it is. It's especially difficult if you're talking about strange characters and alien creatures and all kinds of other things that you can't normally visualize without some kind of visual referencing. So we were very surprised that he agreed to take a chance on it, but it was partially down to the fact that it was a low-budget film. And it would be, at the time, it was going to be about $80 million, and that was, compared to the other films they were producing that year, there were 4 or 5 films that were in the $20 to $30 million class, so it was the low man on the totem pole as far as they were concerned. So they weren't taking much of a risk. If it only did mediocre business, it should be okay. We sold it partially on the idea that if only the hardcore science fiction audience came, we would break even and make a little bit of money. And we were looking at it on the basis that it probably would be that plus 10%. So it was a tremendous surprise to everybody that it eventually did so well, because it was months before we realized that the audiences weren't going down, and they kept increasing the cinemas that it was playing in exponentially every time there were some available. But unlike today, films in that time period were platformed. It wasn't just Star Wars, it was almost all films, where they started in a few cinemas, usually more than the 42 that we did, but say starting at 100 and then expanding to 200 if it proved necessary, and then to 400 and then 600. Now, a big film that they think has potential opens in, say, in North American territories alone, would be 3,000 to 4,000 screens. And the film, even a good film, even a film that makes a lot of money, even films like Avatar, which is the highest grossing film of all time right now, it was only in the cinemas for 3 or 4 months, and then it's gone. So the distribution pattern is completely different than it was in the 70s and 80s. Before we made American Graffiti, yes, we But one of those films was the first film that Francis directed called Adventure 13, which is a kind of low-budget, swanky horror film, which is, you see it today, and it's very, very crude, but fun. It's fun to make. Anyway, he rang me up, and this was in, I think, 1970, and said that he had this war film that he wanted to make about Vietnam. Apocalypse Now was John Lewis had written, and George, he wanted me to come and talk to them about it because none of the people that he had around him had ever been in the military, and I just gotten out of the Marines and was in Vietnam, and so I went up and met George, and he was editing THX at the time. And we talked about Apocalypse Now, and then when Columbia pulled out of that film because it was too controversial, I mean, the war was still going on, so it got shelved. And George said, "I have this idea for this rock and roll film I want to do. It's kind of about growing up in the 50s." And we all were of an age where George and I and Hikes, Willard and Gloria all had gone to high school in this range of time, and we all had experiences that kind of combined into the story. And but at the same time, we talked about the Flash Gordon idea, the idea of doing something that was inspired by the Flash Gordon series in the 1930s, some kind of science fiction piece that had that fun element about it. It wasn't so dour. Science fiction in the 1970s, up until Star Wars and Close Encounters, tended to be very post-apocalyptic, nihilistic, down type of movies. And a lot of the science fiction writing in that period was the same. So they weren't very inspirational on any level. And we wanted to kind of go back to not only the Flash Gordon serials, but films like Forbidden Planet from the 50s, and try to create something like that. So we talked about it all during the American Graffiti period.
Well, mission accomplished. Any other questions from